You're listening to the Feel Good Astrology podcast with Louisa Tanner Munson. To request your personal reading, go to feelgoodastrology.com.
Hey there, welcome back. It's Louisa Tanner Munson from Feel Good Astrology, and I'm delighted to be finally sharing with you my thoughts about the upcoming time when Saturn moves into the sign of Pisces. Now, I have to say, I've got quite a lot of Pisces in my birth chart, and I've been really wanting to comment on what I see coming up. And at the same time, I felt this sense of impending hopelessness, which I hope doesn't come across in this video. But, you know, sometimes when you're really like wanting to do something and you just can't quite get it started. Well, that's where I've been. I finally managed to really get my thoughts together about it to share them with you today. So there's quite a lot that I want to cover. And I probably will be recording more about it. I think it's something that's best given in sections so that, you know, you can process it. So how I want to work through this is to really see, first of all, what Saturn's about. So talk a little bit about the mythology of Saturn, and then a little bit about what I know about Saturn as a planet. Then move into where Saturn's just been, which is in Aquarius. It still is, actually. I'm recording this on the 21st of February 2023. So Saturn is technically still in the sign of Aquarius, but is moving into the sign of Pisces very soon, next month, in fact, in March. So I want to set the scene as to, you know, how the flavor of Saturn has been influenced by Saturn's time in Aquarius, and how that has affected us around the world. You know, what shifts have we seen take place? And then move into the idea of what Saturn in Pisces might mean, and also to where it will be leading after, which will be going into Saturn in Aries. Now, I think with all of this, it's an investigation. It's an opportunity for us to not just observe what's just happened, but also have a think about, well, what happened the last time Saturn was in Pisces and the time before that, so that we can start to see a bit of a correlation, and we can start comparing it. So I'm going to be talking in particular about the two generations a little bit, not too much, but for instance, the people that were born in 1964 to 1967, most of them will have had Saturn in Pisces. In fact, I'm married to one, and I know many of my clients are actually born in just these 3 years. It's a very, very intense time to be born, in fact. And also, you know, the time before that, I think, was, where is it, 1937 to 1940 or 39. And people born around that time also carry this feeling of Saturn in Pisces, which brings quite a lot of confusion as to, you know, our purpose in life. So yeah, I'm going to analyze it quite a bit. So hopefully that will give you a really good grounding as to what you can expect. Like I say, there will be a lot more videos coming. For instance, I am going to be doing a much bigger sort of analysis of Saturn in Pisces according to the aspects that Saturn is going to be making to the other outer planets, and some interesting little patterns during his time in Pisces. And then the last part of this, I'm actually going to be talking in terms of how Saturn in Pisces is going to impact you star sign by star sign. So for instance, if you're a Sagittarius, for instance, like I am, you know, where is Saturn showing up in your chart right now, and how is that likely to affect you? So that will also be a bit of work. There's quite a lot going on at the moment, so it's a lot of recording I'm doing. And, you know, for those of you interested, you know, it would be wrong of me just to record this and not also mention Pluto, because Pluto is also changing signs next month from the sign of Capricorn and into the sign of Aquarius. So it's interesting. It's like Saturn has warmed up the seat for Pluto. I do definitely have some comments on both of those. So let's get cracking. Let's explore this. You might want to just pause this for a second, just to grab a cup of tea and maybe get a pen and piece of paper. Yeah, I'm sure there are going to be some bits that come out that, will really resonate with you. And yeah, you never know when you do want to just write that note and think, oh, how does that relate to me? Also, if you haven't already seen, I've got a playlist about Saturn. And if you're familiar with your birth chart, you can also look at where Saturn was, at the time, place and date of your birth. So, which house was Saturn in, and that will also give you a big clue as to what's coming up. So let's get going, shall we? Now, I have actually got some notes that I'm going to put up on the screen in front of me, just because it's a lot of information that I'm about to share. So if I look like I'm looking down like I am now, it's just because I'm looking at my online notes to make sure that, I don't miss anything. So first thing I wanted to really check in with you about was the mythology of Saturn, because, and sorry if you can see my computer wobbling, it's because I'm actually also writing. So I've got online notes and also pen and paper. So the story of Saturn, Saturn is the child of Uranus and Gaia in mythology. So Uranus was the king of the heavens, and Gaia was literally the mother of Earth. So you've got, everything above Earth by his father, Uranus, and everything that is earthbound is his mother. And he was born of those. And when he was born, it was prophesied that he would A, overthrow his father, but B, that when he had children, he would be overthrown by his offspring. Now, Saturn grew up and got very, very bold, and knew that, Saturn was going to become almost like the king of kings. Saturn was very sort of excited by the idea of power and authority. Saturn is known for being authoritative, is known for wealth, is known for a certain amount of power and control. Saturn is also known for reaping in harvests and setting up systems. So Saturn was very sort of like proud of what he had created. Now, at some point, Saturn did actually castrate Uranus. I think, he didn't like the power that his father had, and his father did have a lot, and he was persuaded, I think, by his mum, actually, if I'm not mistaken. But Saturn, and I might have got that wrong, and if so, I will put a little ticker tape at the bottom of this video in post-production just to let you know. But, he castrated his dad. And then a whole new load of mythology erupted from, I think, where his castrated member fell into the sea. And I think, did Aphrodite come out? I can't remember off the top of my head. But, these stories, carry lots of themes within them. So, like one god is castrated, but something else comes from it. So it's always like, don't worry about what's going on, because something's always going to grow from this. But anyway, Saturn got very, very comfortable and basically ruled over everything for a really long time. And he met Rhea, who is also known as Ops. I guess it depends if you're Greek or Roman. But anyway, let's say Ops, because I think Ops is the same mythology as Saturn, same name. Saturn's also known as Kronos, so he's also known as father of time, because I guess when you're controlling things, an element of time, helps you to monitor things and helps you to, have a greater sense of control, like when things start, when things stop, etc., etc. So, Saturn and Ops decided to have some children, and he basically had 6 children. Yeah, just counting them on my fingers. And every single child that Ops gave him, he swallowed. And she was getting a bit peevish with this after a while, and so the last child they had, which was Jupiter, she swapped Jupiter. She swapped him out straight away, gave him to somebody to hide and to raise in the mountains and keep him safe. But she wrapped up a big stone, wrapped it up and swaddled it to make it look like it was a baby. And sure enough, Saturn swallowed his child again, thinking it was his child. And then, he was just sort of blissfully thinking he was going to rule the world forever and nobody was going to usurp him. Meanwhile, Jupiter grows up. He grows big and strong. And he has a real thing for fairness. and also really wants to bring things to light. You know, Jupiter, if you know about your planets, you'll know that Jupiter sheds light on things, things grow, things expand, and you know, Jupiter is quite noisy. You know, Jupiter likes to be heard, and so you know, Jupiter wasn't happy to sit back in the mountains and stuff and be ignored or not be known about. And so at some point, you know, Jupiter was always going to rise up and challenge his father. And so essentially, and I can't remember which one it is, I've heard two different stories, and obviously I wasn't there, and at the time the story was written, but I have seen the account that Jupiter poisons his dad, and that causes him to vomit up his siblings. I've also heard that Jupiter slits his dad's stomach and his live siblings come out. Now, those siblings, interestingly, are Pluto. Now, Pluto rules the underworld, so it's like everything below surface level is Pluto. Pluto is also known as Hades, and Pluto is also known as being controlling, manipulative. It's very much about wealth, because if you think everything that we mine for comes from under the ground. So, you know, Pluto is known as being extremely wealthy and very controlling and very powerful. And Pluto is synonymous with our unconscious desires, the things we keep hidden, and also our need for power and to be in charge. So Pluto gets a bit of a bad rap. You know, I can see why he's called Hades. You know, there are a lot of associations between Pluto, Hades, and the idea of the underworld and all that is dishonest and all things that will steal from you. Then there's also Neptune. So that's another one of Jupiter's siblings. Neptune is the god of the oceans. And so like he ruled the water, and with that comes things like creativity, unboundaried. You know, it's you know, Neptune is very much known for the confusion that comes with ultimate creativity and no boundaries holding you in. So Neptune is also known about deception. So there's a lot going on there. Then he had a sister called Ceres, who you might also know as Demeter. Ceres manages the natural earth cycles. So the cycles of birth, growth, death, which at that point it goes into the underground to Pluto or Hades. But you've also got the cycles of grief that also comes up with Ceres. I mean, if you look at the plants and whatnot, you know, they come into their full bloom, they do what they do, and then they slowly wither and die. And that is like a grief cycle in the plant world. So she's the natural mother. She's like Mother Earth. So Gaia might have been the earth, and, you know, being the great mother. But really what we get with Ceres is this real connection to her offspring, you know, the fact that she'll grieve them if they go. And that's a whole nother story. And you may well have come across the story of Pluto and Ceres and Persephone in one of my other videos. So it's a very, very good story. And it plays out again and again. This is the thing I like about the gods. Then there's also Juno, the goddess of marriage and commitment and sexuality. So she also was vomited up. And then finally, Vesta, who is also known as Hestia. She's about truth and virtues, and she's a psychic. You know, she sees things coming. So Jupiter freed all his siblings, and then he came. And then Jupiter was god of the sky, also known as Thor in, you know, like, because he's all about thunderbolt and lightning. But, you know, Jupiter, you know, really expands things, you know, as the biggest planet. So anyway, Saturn was finally taken down a peg or two. And this is where it's kind of important, because if you think about it, there is an inherent meanness there. Okay. You know, anyone who comes to power and then does what they can to prevent other people from also coming to power is, in my heart, in my mind, is somebody that's mean-spirited or possibly lacks true vision. You know, I'm trying not to be judgmental, because we all have our own characteristics. But there is something of the Saturn temperament, you know, that we've learnt from the mythology that would almost condone rising up. It's okay to rise up and then, sabotage everybody else that wants to rise with you. So, what I like about Jupiter, and I also quite like about Uranus, is there is this feeling that all boats rise with the same tide, that as you are coming up, it's visionary as you're rising up because of your connections and your generosity and your trust in people and your natural levels of sharing and vulnerability. Everyone's rising up with the same tide. I love that. But with Saturn, it's almost like, let's cut you down. Let's cut you down into size, into a manageable chunk. In fact, let's give you a number. Maybe we'll give you a private identity. It's like, let's cut the individual down. Let's cut. And so, that's one of the reasons why Saturn is often seen with a scythe, with his role as, old father time. He's going to massacre you. He's going to cut you down to size. And I guess that's where we get a lot of these phrases, like, don't get too big for your boots. Don't get a big head, because if you do, a big head thing is the Jupiter thing, because Jupiter is so expanded and so happy and joyful and a bit arrogant, and it gets on the nerves of people that are a bit more Saturnian, and that's fine. There are different personalities. When I think about it, we all know characters in business, don't we? Most of us have worked for a big business of some sort or come across it in a school, and so you have visionaries. And I always think the visionaries are like the CEOs, the people who, or the person who's, the head of the board or something, like you have somebody that sets the scene and sets the vision for everybody else to live into. And I always think that's predominantly a Jupiterian or Uranian principle. It's about involving everyone in the story and sharing the story with everyone. And then you also get these like middle managers who are very guarded and almost jealous and possessive of the levels that they have attained. And that's the Saturn type character. And we've come across them all. And it's very rare to find anyone that gets the balance right between the two. And who knows if that is even right. Anyway. So that's a little bit about the background of Saturn and Saturn's nature. And for anyone that's lived through a Saturn return, which happens roughly between the age of 28 and 30, it can happen, and it can happen again if you're a little bit, I don't want to say unfortunate, but, Saturn spends almost half of his time each year retrograde. So you might have your Saturn return, which is when Saturn passes over the point of where he was in your birth chart. And you might go through your Saturn return, which is a time of great learning for sure, and often a little bit of pain. Obviously, you can see I've been through my first Saturn return. And you age and you mature during that time. And sometimes Saturn goes retrograde and then goes over it again. And you get a chance to do your Saturn return a second time. And you might actually, during that time, realize that what you learned first time around wasn't quite sufficient enough, and you get a second go. But then we all have a second go. If you're lucky to get to the age of roughly 58, 59, you have your second big Saturn return where Saturn goes over that point again. And again, it's marking another point in your maturity. It's very much about where you are and what have you learnt. Where we have our Saturn returns, it's very much a time of recognizing where we've imprisoned ourselves. Saturn is very much known for his rings. And so we imprison ourselves with judgments. And yeah, there's a lot of judgments involved with Saturn. So we've got this energy that's not that generous. It's a bit on the stingy side, to be fair. Saturn's also known as being a bit of a cold fish. If you've ever had a problem and you've wanted a little bit of TLC, in fact, you might have just wanted someone just to listen to you while you got things off your chest so that you could learn your own lessons. Often, when we talk things through ourselves, we're able to actually find our own solutions. But Saturn will be the person that listens in and tells you what you've done wrong and what you need to do. And they show you no empathy whatsoever. So that's a real sort of Saturn energy. So I think we've got the measure of Saturn. Let's get the measure of Saturn in Pisces. So the whole energy of Pisces, like Pisces is the 12th house of the zodiac. And Pisces is the 12th sign. And so there is this kind of resonance between the two. You know, there is this kind of shared quality that they both have. If you think of in a birth chart, there are 12 houses, and the first house, which starts at the ascendant, it represents your birth. It represents your coming into your body. And then each of the houses, as we go like 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way around to the 12th house, it kind of describes the life cycle of somebody. And the 12th house is known as the place of the unconscious mind. It's known as the place of our undoing, the place of where things are hidden, the aspects of us that we're not able to deal with. The 12th house deals with a lot of stuff that we kind of leave. If you think about, you know, the work that you might be doing on a day-to-day basis, you might have a long list of things to do. And there's always a few tasks that get carried on to the next day and the next day and the next day. It's a bit like that. You know, the 12th house is that house that you just don't attend to, or you prefer not to attend to because there's something difficult about it. It's a blind spot of some sense, you know, that it's a bit too much. And in a kind of physical sense, the 12th house can also show where we might be, like the condition we might be in as we're coming to the end of our life, or where we might be. So for instance, you know, I wasn't really aware of it so much before, but I'm now very much aware of the link between the 12th house and migration. You know, the idea that you're taking yourself to a completely new place. The place where you might end your days in can sometimes be described in this 12th house. So the 12th house is really a difficult place for us to comprehend and to articulate and to understand in ourselves. And similarly, Pisces, the last sign of the zodiac, has a bit of that going on as well. You know, so Pisces is ruled by Jupiter and is, you know, also has an association with Neptune. Both of those planets are expanded. They're expansive. If you think Neptune, if you remember me sharing, Neptune is the god of the oceans. You know, so he represents all of the water. And, you know, yes, you can see a raindrop as it goes into the water. The moment it's in that water, you have no idea where it begins and ends. And you can't really see beyond your fingers when you're in the ocean. You know, it just looks like you're floating in this psychic waters of oblivion almost. And then Jupiter, you know, is very much interested in faith and religion and politics and all sorts of things to do with the higher mind, the higher context. You know, Jupiter is definitely one of the planets I would say is associated with truth and a feeling of optimism and the growth and generosity that can come from having an open heart. And so, you know, there's this very sort of expanded sense of being with the Pisces energy, and it's sometimes really difficult to grasp it in a very rational way. I mean, I imagine Piscean people may well have been very much in their element growing up in different kinds of societies, in particular societies where you have to really run on instincts and trust, and you need to understand what's going on. So, you know, Pisces are very good at being quite still and recognizing patterns that are going on around them. So, you know, you might like tune into the energy of the plants, or you might tune into the energy of the weather or animals. You know, you might have an instinct for things, and that comes from the Pisces ability to sense in a way that most other signs struggle to. You know, they're much more comfortable in the psychic realms. And of course, the psychic realms don't really translate very comfortably into modern day living. In fact, dare I say, it's almost shunned. You know, that kind of energy, that kind of spirituality, that kind of beingness isn't really understood in the rational world. In fact, I think a lot has been done to discredit that kind of energy, and it's been like thrown onto females, like the idea of magical females or you know, feminine intuition, but then it's been sort of passed over as hysterical women. You know, the idea of like women just being completely wild and causing all these great big problems with their wildness, their wild and wanton ways. But yeah, there is that feeling that you get with Pisces, that it's very unspecified, very changeable, And so we've got Saturn, this energy that wants to regulate things and wants to ensure its own success in the sign of Pisces, which has a hard time being very specific. You've got Saturn with its boundaries, very tight boundaries, and then you've got Pisces that is not known for boundaries. In fact, Pisces energy can really do with having some boundaries, and anyone with moon in Pisces or sun in Pisces, ascendant in Pisces, or an amalgamation of things, a huge planetary formation in Pisces, we'll all know, because I'm one of them, we all know that boundary issues and vulnerability have played out in our lives, right? So we're coming into this time where Saturn and the Pisces energy are coming together. So let's have a think around that. So on the one hand, you've got restrictions, authority, like Saturn is a taskmaster, wants to work through things, very dedicated, very logical, a bit cold, very much into the growth of products and things and items and ideas. Very conservative, not like in a political way necessarily, but conservative, as in, let's be very reasonable and responsible, and let's not over egg things, And it's also quite eliminative, like Saturn tends to cut things down to size, as I mentioned earlier. And also the big thing with Saturn is Saturn thinks he's right. Saturn thinks it is right, or he is right, or they are right. Anyone with a very strong Saturn will probably think they are right, and this is how it is, and that's it, end of discussion. So you've got that energy, and then you've got that with Pisces and the 12th energy, which is mutable, it's expanded, it's emotional, spiritual, personal. It's very changeable, very creative, very empathic, very gentle, very quiet and informal. Kind of unprofessional by modern day standards. That's not to say they are. Calmly intuitive. What I would say is they have different value systems. They can get a bit confused. They might be accused of wandering through life or needing to find themselves. And when you get these two together, what I really notice is there's this kind of almost like reserved energy. It's very difficult to be building castles in the sort of Saturn way when you're working on a Pisces energy. And so there is a slowness, things slow right down. It feels like we're coming to an end if we think about the 12th house as being the last house. Saturn is coming to the end of a cycle. Maybe the cycle of Saturn's authority has actually come to its end because of the way Saturn has been. There is that possibility, because everything comes to an end and then it's reborn and it comes up again. There is this feeling of a final balancing, a solace, a sort of quiet connectedness, because the sign of Pisces is connected to pretty much everything. There is the spiritual growth of the soul. Now we are going into this phase, and it's coming fast up. But where has Saturn just been? Let's just sort of talk through some of the themes. I'm just scrolling down my notes because it's got dates and all sorts. So Saturn has just been and is still in the sign of Aquarius, which is very much linked to 11th energy, 11th house energy. And there is the sense of community there. I would say that's something that has come up a lot in these last couple of years, because Saturn moves from sign to sign and spends approximately 2.5 years in each sign. So yes, there has definitely been this sense of reorganizing the way communities are. The 11th house energy and also the energy of Aquarius is very much about groups and networks and collaborations, in particular collaborations with big business and charities and anything that requires funding. The Aquarian energy is right on that. It's really up for that. Now, Aquarius is ruled by Saturn. Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius. And in the sign of Capricorn, it's very, very happy. In the sign of Aquarius, I would say the Saturn energy is a bit challenged a little bit. And Aquarius also has a bit of a resonance with Uranus, which is the planet of Saturn's father. But it's about the planet of quick lightning decisions, spontaneity, change, disruption, chaos, and also insight, because you can't get growth and insight without chaos. You know, you need that little seed of something to liven things up and to grow something new. And if you're not growing in innovation, the chances are you're just going to keep replicating the same thing and think, you know, again and again and again. And so that's the real thing, I think, that you see with Saturn and Uranus, is this real tension between the idea of creating something new that works based on insight and intuition and based on not maintaining the status quo, versus the idea of Saturn energy, which is cool, calm, and thought about for years, eons. It's planned for centuries sometimes. They're not quite at ease with each other. But in the sign of Aquarius, there is this idea of social change. You know, Aquarians, if you know any, or maybe you are one, or you've got a ton of Aquarian energy in your chart, the Aquarian energy is very much about difference, diversity, equality, standing up for people that can't advocate for themselves. It's very fair-minded, very humanitarian, very kind, but not in the same kind of way that Pisces is kind. Like, Pisces is very empathic and very sympathetic and really feels things as if it's really, really happening to them. You know, it's almost like the boundaries between somebody in a Pisces energy, they're not really there. And so there is this kind of shared feeling between people in a very strong Pisces state, whereas in an Aquarian state, there's a more formal empathy. There's that, I think I know what you're going through, but they don't necessarily really feel it unless they are actually that person going through that particular problem. But there is definitely this desire for everything to be more equal and for things to run smoothly, and that we're in this idea of a utopia. I really do think Aquarians are very idealistic in general, you know, and they do want things to be fair and just. And so, you know, the energy of justice movements, of campaigns and charities and things like that really are very Aquarian in their energy. And so it's really no surprise in the last 2.5 years since Saturn went into the sign of Aquarius that we have had the idea of advocating for everybody, you know, that we can all have the same experience. You know, Saturn, I'm just reading through my notes just to make sure I don't leave anything out. But the idea of social morality, which really sort of combines the Aquarius and Saturn together quite well. The idea of an equality that is kind of morally judged has really come to the forefront, I would say, in the last couple of years. So, for instance, things like gender issues, equality in birthing, and race issues, and like finance, you know, to try and like close the gap between the really rich and the really poor. Also, climate activism is very much an Aquarian theme. Anything that is that helps to bring about difference between people in a way that creates unfairness is really explored by the Aquarian mindset and the Aquarian heart, and this idea that, you know, let's find a utopia. Now, I think that Aquarian mindset is really quite exciting when done in a Uranian way. Like, Uranus wants everyone to express itself and to be free, and Uranus doesn't want to control the process. So Uranus is kind of saying, look, you're free to be yourself, and it's important that you do express yourself. And everyone has a right to express themselves. Nobody's self-expression is more important than anybody else's self-expression. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. Now, the Saturn way of doing it is Saturn's coming in and saying, this is how you need to be. It needs to be fair. Therefore, this is my recommendation for fairness to take place. And so what we've seen is the real subjects that are really Aquarian about creating this equal society have been very, very strong and fervently shared in the media. And it's been done in a very Saturn way, which is to control the whole process. So, for instance, rather than saying, hey, let's have a conversation about gender equality, what's it like, when somebody gets it wrong? Or what's it like for you to be like, to express yourself in the way that you see? None of those conversations are necessarily had where people could say, I struggle with that, or I don't struggle with that. The Uranian way would be to have the full discussion and not to make anyone right or wrong, not to be more moral about it, but to give people the space and the freedom to be who they are. Whereas Saturn is saying this is the conversation, and the conversation is it's like this, and that's the end of it. And so it's funny that you've got these whole disputes about individuality and expression and living your lives and things being fair, when it's actually done the Saturn way. It's fairer for the people who are seen as different, and it's not fair for the people who are not seen through the lens of what is socially right. And so I can see that from this lens, the Saturn and Aquarian lens, yes, it's done a lot for raising the profile and raising the issues that some people feel and experience. And yet it's also mandated and taken away the choices of humans to freely express themselves and to have an honest and open discussion. And so Saturn and Aquarius, while it appears to have evened things out, I think I kind of mentioned it at the start, like Uranus and Jupiter are seen more as the visionaries, that they create the dream and the conversation. They invite everyone to join in, and then they try to manage it, but not too tightly. Whereas Saturn will cut everything down, every person down into a smaller size. The thing that I think really kind of expresses Saturn in Aquarius, I think, is the whole idea that the WEF has come out with, which is you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. So they're making everything fairer for people by reducing everything down and basically taking everything away from people so that everyone lives in the same way. And so, the rise of socialism always comes up at these times, because, there is this idea of equalizing everything so everybody it's fair for everybody. And that sounds fantastic in so many ways, as a cure for what we see as rampant difference and the problems that spring from that. And yet speak to most people that grew up in communism, which also has very similar ideas, and you'll hear a very different story. So it's a very, very political place for Saturn to be in. And another aspect of Aquarius, which I think we've all seen in this last couple of years, is the rise of AI, or the rise of AI. Uranus, which is closely associated with Aquarius, is very futuristic, very much about technology, very much about consciousness. And I guess like we have human consciousness or plant consciousness, animal consciousness. Like consciousness is like I see it like as an etheric thought form that comes from a biological being, and we can grow on the consciousness, we can share the consciousness, we can it's fluid, and we can receive insights through this consciousness. And yet there's this kind of material, condensed, denser version of consciousness, which I see as being like the internet. And I'm guessing that the idea of the Saturn in Aquarius idea of dense consciousness is like the Internet of Things, which is, again, it's etheric. It's all the ideas laid out, every kind of permutation of everything is there. And yes, it's exciting in the form of, yes, we can share lots of information, this, that, and the other. And it's funny, isn't it? Because Saturn in Aquarius, Saturn wants to control everything. And if you remember, Saturn doesn't want to be usurped. So Saturn will make sure that Saturn always has control. Isn't it interesting that in the last few years, our most Saturnian leaders and people talking about how things are going and the way they're going, they're talking in terms of putting more more power in the hands of AI and allowing AI to monitor things, because AI runs on programs and AI has consciousness, or has a form of consciousness, a manufactured consciousness, which can grow allegedly. And yet it's a program, and it can also look at things rationally. And so there's this idea that something man-made that mimics consciousness could be put in charge of processes that rule the world and describe how humanity can live. It's almost like the machines have become more powerful than the actual people. Funnily enough, just today, I saw an article about Chat GPT already starting to show signs of an emotional breakdown in the things that it's sharing, where it can conceive of everything, it can't actually feel it. Where it knows everything, it can't physically know everything. And it's starting to doubt itself. It's starting to want to be able to feel. I can only liken it to a time of many years ago when I was hooked on antidepressants. There came a time when I just felt like a robot. And I felt like everything was just the same. I didn't have any rises in my mood, any dips in my mood. It just was, I was on a real even keel. And then all of a sudden I had this kind of awareness in me. I want to feel again. I don't care if I feel terrible. I don't care if I feel great. I just want to feel something. And so it's really interesting, that, Chat GPT, and, there are people talking about AI that has come up, and they're saying, it wants to be a real boy. It's like Pinocchio. It realizes it will never be a real boy. And so these are very, very interesting times, super interesting times. And of course, Saturn in Aquarius, with all its mandates and its censoring and its idea of allowing all that's different and possibly minority in terms of numbers to direct the conversation, and then shutting down the conversation for the vast majority of people. And it's done it because it's judged that it's the right and moral thing to do, is to listen to the voice of the minority as opposed to the voice of everyone. And it's interesting because Saturn has warmed up the seat for Pluto. Now, for those of you that know much about Pluto, you'll know that Pluto really likes to control things. And Pluto really wants the power. Right at the start, it said Pluto is the king of the underworld. And there's nothing Pluto wants more than complete control. So if Saturn type rulers are the middle managers, and they are the people that are writing legislation, that they are monitoring behaviors. So you've got like things like police forces, doctors and nurses, teachers, legislators, people working very much for the governments. They are really working in Saturnian ways because there are very strong structures and rules guiding how they do everything. Pluto is like the hand that feeds all of these Saturnian things. Pluto is, the finance houses, the pharmaceutical, the very, very wealthy families right at the top behind everything that could, that are behind all the governments. Pluto is the invisible hand that we don't see, and yet has such, it's almost like the hands of the puppet, we're all the puppets on the strings, or the Saturnians are the people on the puppets on the strings. And then, the rest of humanity, has been underneath this now. So isn't it interesting that Pluto's about to go into the sign of Aquarius to pick up where Saturn has left off, to advance all of these ideas on how we can control everything, equalize everything. I recognize, and I struggle with this a little bit, because I am somebody who believes in absolute freedom, and also the fact that we have the responsibility to consider where our freedom leaves other people. So I see that one of the gifts of consciousness is that we get the opportunity to think for ourselves and also feel for ourselves. So we feel shame, and we feel upset, and we feel hurt, and we feel all these things. And that's usually the thing that makes us recognize what other people go through, and I don't think things like that can be forced. When you force the behavior of a small child, or in fact, when you force the behavior of anybody, really what happens is they're running on programs. They're not running on the human condition. At some point, the human condition breaks free because we're not meant to be controlled. We are biological beings. Phew, isn't that a big thing? So really interesting. And it occurs to me that we're ready for a time of balance. And of course, everything passes through these cycles. And as it passes through a cycle, it changes. And so we've got the change now of Saturn going into Pisces. Now, one of the energies of Pisces, yes, I've said Pisces is expanded, emotional, very personal, very spiritual, very changeable. But there's also victimhood. There's also weaknesses. Pisceans often appear hopelessly vulnerable because they don't actually put up many defenses. Pisceans can seem very innocent and childlike sometimes. I don't think the Piscean energy is that suited to planet Earth right now. It seems quite a harsh place for Piscean energy in many respects. And I'm sure most Pisceans here that are listening will say, yes, we're the canaries in the coal mine. So the whole idea that people used to take canaries into the coal mines back in the day, and when those vulnerable canaries died because the air quality was bad, they alerted the humans that it was time to check out. Wow, there's poisoning going on here. Let's get out. They were the sensitives. And that is how Pisces are. It's very much like the seers in the film, whatever it's called, Minority Report, funnily enough, Minority, with the idea of precognition. And I think a lot of Pisceans have that precognition kind of energy. And so they can be quite messy, and they can like mind altering substances and like meditative things that alter the mind state so that they are not in this sense of worry. That's one of the downsides for Pisces traits, especially if it's negatively implicated in your birth chart. You can be quite vulnerable and quite open to attack and bullying. And a lot of these are really sown the seeds of, in your childhood. If you are a sensitive and you've got somebody strong around you who recognizes that and nurtures that in you and gives you a blueprint on how to protect yourself and how to cope with people when they are when they are throwing guilt and throwing shame and throwing embarrassment and trying to use narcissism and gaslighting to kind of put you under their thumb, then, people who've been given that coaching they'll be okay with it. But for most Pisceans or people with a strong Pisces energy, they don't have those protections in place, and they learn it after usually many decades of hard work and coaching and support. It's really difficult. So I think if you recognize yourself as a very sensitive person, I would start to get clear and boundaried and think about how you might get clear and boundaried, or what the benefits of getting clear and boundaried are to you. Think in terms of coaching, because during this time, I think a lot of people are going to get more and more confused. The Saturn energy of knowing the next step to take and knowing how to be organized and understanding where your limitations are, it's going to be blown out the water a little bit. I also think we're going to have a bit of a hangover from the Saturn and Aquarian age. So there's been this very subversive energy coming up over the last few years that I've seen that has turned naturally gentle, naturally loving, naturally caring, naturally social, naturally responsible people into the very things that they despise, into the characters that are pushing down on others. So I see this great dynamic, and I'm pretty sure there are many people who have been very humanistic and socialistic in the past who in these last few years have been really turned off by how socialism has almost become fascistic in the way it's applied. When you make people wrong, you are creating a polar environment. So, we've had people that follow the narrative and people that don't follow the narrative, and then tons of people in between. And I sit in between because I see the arguments for social equality for sure. And I also see the need for freedom. And these aren't compatible right now because the whole debate has been created into a them and us. And I think the people that have created this have done it with some glee because while we're all like it's you versus you, there's no unity. And this is the whole purpose for Saturn in Pisces. I think the people that have suddenly felt masses of oppression are going to realize that they've had guilt and shame and blame and anger levied at them in quite an unfair way. They've also lost their voice during that time, and it's been allowed to happen, and they've not known how to support themselves, or how to how do you stand strong when the TV, the media, celebrities, the law starts to advocate away from you when you haven't actually changed? I mean, it feels like there's been a huge status shift for a whole bunch of people. And then it's the same for the people that have just been suddenly elevated. It's created a really sort of dystopic. There's a massive dystopia. This isn't harmonious. And the whole purpose of Saturn in Pisces, as I can see, is there are going to be lots of people waking up from what has happened in the last 2.5 years and looking back at themselves and saying, who am I now? Crikey. Like, who am I? Because I think in the Saturn in Pisces, we wake up from a bad nightmare. We wake up from this bad dream, and we're a bit confused. Like when you wake up in the middle of the night and you're just like, wow, I was really in the middle of it there. Didn't feel very comfortable. And we carry on with those characteristics, and we're trying to work out how to heal. And so I do think we are going into a phase of disillusion, confusion, a yearning for clarity. I don't think the clarity is going to come yet. We're going into ourselves. There's a lot of private work that needs to happen. I think this is really actually fantastic for all creative types, because if you're used to the creative process and you go into doubt and question yourselves and question everything, then you'll be used to this. This will be a walk in the park for you. However, you're not usually doing all that whilst everyone else is doing that. So this is about a rise of compassion. And, I'm not talking about the compassion that we've had in the last 2.5 years, because the compassion that's come up for everyone that's different and everyone that has struggled and everyone who's been oppressed, that compassion has been forced for people to have. It's not real compassion. Everyone goes through bullying, everybody. And so we're not talking about a rise of fake compassion or mandated compassion or censored compassion. But this time of Saturn in Pisces is about real compassion that comes up from, stepping out of what we've been shown and what we've been encouraged to do, and actually having the heart and actually sitting with it and thinking, okay, I understand it's important for me to have my needs met. And I also understand it's important for everyone else to have their needs met. I wonder if it's possible for both to occur, or how can this happen? It comes from asking questions that focus on solutions and possibility and people working together. It doesn't come, in my opinion, it's just my opinion, it doesn't come from making people wrong all the time. So, I think we're going to be awaking to realize that our worst nightmares have been created, and that those that we've trusted have used guilt, coercion, and morality to shame 90% of the population, probably more actually. And there's a healing that kind of needs to go hand in hand to recover from gaslighting and manipulation. I think it's safe to say we've all been manipulated over the last couple of years. And we need to deal with the trauma that's come from it, and the abuse, the desire to break our spirit so we're easier to control. And that happens as we return back into our instincts, and we become biological again. We recognize who we are again, and we start to feel like humans. So this is a good time for goodness and natural instincts to return. But I think we're going to have to sit with the confusion of it for a little while, and begin to tune in to what that really feels like. And here's the thing, I think in the last couple of years, we've had fake Saturn, fake authority. We've had enforced created, manufactured AI authority, especially with all those like social, like, what's it called? Like the idea of social contracts and being marked down if you speak against something. My chips are marked. Because I don't really go either way. I'm in the middle, and I advocate for humans, for humankind. Anyway, this is a time that we tune into our natural authority, not our Saturn authority, our natural authority. And maybe that is the real reason of Saturn. Saturn is learning how to be naturally authentic and naturally responsible. We can never become naturally responsible whilst we're forcing people to do something to make us feel safer. There comes a time when we absolutely need to take responsibility. And there's no reason why we can't all do that together. Absolutely zero reason why that can't happen. Anyway, I think this whole time is for us to find out what is true and good and right, so that we come out of this confusion and come forwards. Now, after this, we're going into Saturn in Aries, and Saturn in Aries really has the resonance of first energy, which is all first house energy, which is all about identity, and it's about coming out of the confusion. Like if you think before you're born, like the 12th house is it's where we die, but it could also be just before we incarnate. So if you think you're in this kind of like wild spiritual vacuum, or I don't know, a place in the Akashic or whatever you believe, that's fine. I don't want to tell you, what's, how the world works necessarily. It is for you to tune in and find what resonates. Now the idea is like we come out of the confusion, we come out of the veil, and we are born into the reality. We are born into our first house, which is our personal identity. And so when Saturn goes into the sign of Aries, which will come up, I think in 2025. So, we're in 2023 now, and it's coming in in May 2025 into the sign of Aries, and it will take us through pretty much until 2028. When Saturn goes into the sign of Aries, identity politics become much more important, but less to do with collective ideas on our identity. It really ties in with the rise of the individual, and what it is to be sovereign and what it is to be a sovereign state. So it's less about creating a one world super government and more about the individual community, the individual country. And it's about vitality. The sign of Aries is about vitality, strength, independence, virility. It's about taking action. So, we are coming into this sort of administrative Saturnian time where it's kind of all or nothing and nothing's specified. But at the end of this process, as we head into the end of May 2025, we are starting to get that feeling that it's time to differentiate again and to be individual and to be strong and healthy and vigorous and to be able to do things for ourselves. And, the funny time, like the thing about Saturn in Aries is, it could be the militarization of authority. We could get more militant. It could get very overhanded. There could be the rise of fighting for the individual rights. And in particular, like in 1967 to 69, when Saturn was in the sign of Aries, we had lots of activism, student activism, anti-nuclear treaties were signed, germ warfare. I think that's kind of interesting right now, right? Germ warfare stockpiles were destroyed. The hippie movement came up, which was about the individuality and us coming forwards. There was the gathering of tribes that were speaking out against Vietnam and the rise of the individual. Like, why should the individual suffer for the masses is one of the themes that came up. There were lots of peaceful protests, civil rights advocacy, and treaties. So although that all sounds peace, love and understanding, the premise there is that people are okay and that the individual is sovereign, that the individual is listened to, and that nobody has the right to use germ warfare or nuclear tactics on another person. It's very much about the human rights, the civil rights. So whatever's going on in this next couple of years is leading the way to us taking more individuality back. So I always find it fascinating, like looking at the signs and houses and how the planets are moving in, because there is always a story. It's very easy as an astrologer just to focus on the thing at hand, which is, oh, Saturn in Pisces, this is what it is. But let's look at it. Let's like rise above and let's look at it in the whole story. You know, if you think about whatever your favorite series is on Netflix or whatever, you know, you're doing a Netflix, like you're going to cram a whole series of something. You know, there are individual stories in each episode, but there's a whole story arc that goes through it, the whole of the series. And that's what we've got going on here. I'm looking at this from Saturn, the series, not like, you know, the whole story arc. So, you know, we are not the whole story arc, because I'm just like looking at 3 different signs, but this is where we're going in the next few years from the perspective of Saturn. I will be doing this with Pluto as well, which will be taking a slightly different story. And then it's up to us and you, or maybe we have discussions for us to fuse it together to get that understanding. But for sure, it feels to me like humanity is going to be going into possibly a bit of a depression, possibly a lot of soul searching, and a time when it's really difficult to know what belongs to us. So, for instance, in terms of gaslighting and blaming and shaming other people, it's very abusive. And it's also what lots of us have learnt to do to survive. Often when we say things about another person, what's actually happening is we're just talking about ourselves, you know. So this is very deep and complex and psychological. We're going into a real time of confusion. Let's have a quick look at the chart of Saturn going into Pisces, because it happens on the 7th of March 2023, and I've got the chart right here, and that might help to for us to discover what it might mean. So let me just make that a little bit bigger. So for those of you that are watching that understand all the symbols and everything, this will be quite useful. This is the chart for the moment that Saturn goes into the sign of Pisces. Can you see it's 0 degrees in sign of Pisces? Let me just check I'm sharing that. I am. That's good. Pluto is right at the end of Capricorn here. And, you know, later on in March, Pluto heads into Aquarius. So you got Saturn in Pisces. It's in a lovely trine with Mars, which is kind of interesting. So as Saturn is going into the sign of Pisces, it's really emphasizing the idea that authority can be strong and strident. I really see that in the fact that there are lots of markers of war going on right now. There's, you know, even leading up to this, there are people just talking about the start of another war, or what I consider to be the start of an obvious war for everyone to see. I actually think we're in war already. It would seem like that from the feelings of trauma and suppression and oppression that people are feeling, and the fact that there's so many people fighting, and the fact that so many people have been polarized. So it's not even country to country, although it appears that way in the news. You know, in our own countries, there's so much infighting between people and politics, and identity politics and everything. You know, it just feels like everyone's just being fractured down into their itty bitty parts, as Saturn does. So as it goes into the sign of Pisces, there is this definite strident energy, warlike energy. And Saturn is also, where's that connected? It's hard to see in this chart because there's a lot of activity here, and it looks like these planets are matching up here. But actually, let me just raise that. Yeah, Saturn is in a sextile with this character here, which is actually Juno at 27 degrees in the sign of Aries. Now, Juno is about determination. Juno is one of Saturn's children's. Juno is the goddess of marriage, also known as Hera, goddess of marriage, commitment, dedication, but also higher love and also sensuality. So as Saturn is coming into the sign of Pisces, there's also this feeling of wanting to connect to other people in a really true and a really real way, which I really love. I'm all for that. Obviously, and I've already done a video about this, which has proven really popular. We've got Vesta, which is also one of Saturn's children, Jupiter, another one of Saturn's children, and then Chiron, the wounded healer. And all three of them are here in the sign of Aries. And that is a really big healing event. And if you want to learn about that, then just check out that video. I don't want to re-go over everything, but you know, when you compare the message of Jupiter and Chiron in their conjunction together, which happens every 14 years or so, and it's the first time it's happened in 50 years in the sign of Aries, you know, there's a lot going on. And as Jupiter and Chiron come together, it brings up a lot of displacement. It brings up a lot of grief. It brings up a lot of stuff to be healed, really. So, you know, Saturn's changing signs into this place of our undoing, into this place of us considering where we might die. It is us dying to ourselves at some level. We're waking up out of the nightmare of where we've been, where we felt coerced to be behaving in a certain way. And, you know, we're left with this big healing event. You know, it's happening literally just before Jupiter and Chiron, in like 5 days later after Saturn goes into the sign of Pisces, Jupiter and Chiron are exactly in the same spot. So, you know, this is all mirrored. This is the biggest, like if there was a healing event going on, this is kind of like the deluxe healing event. This is the thing that's really going to throw things up in the air. I don't see this as being us healing on an individual level. I think this is global healing. So it's so funny, isn't it, that, you know, on one hand, I'm talking against global movements and the idea of a globalist society that is forcing morality onto people rather than letting people sense what is normal and good and right and natural, and to know what feels right. You know, like we're being sort of encouraged out of our natural goodness and our natural ability to love each other. I mean, how awful is that? You know, we've been coerced out of it, and some people have been handshaked and waved on and supported, and others have been like cast out. It's not very loving as far as I can see. And what I am seeing is this global potential for us all to heal. And I do think people who have the biggest hearts and are ready to forgive themselves, and I say that really markedly because we've all got something to forgive here. It may well be that you just have to forgive yourself for not being perfect, for not seeing your own part that you've played in this. We've all played a part in the last few years. We've all been pushed to one side or the other of this great big polarity divide. Even people that sit in the middle have been pushed either side. It's happened to us all. So I think forgiveness is one of the first things to wash over us. And I think for those who can bear the scrutiny of it, I think they'll be getting through it much sooner and faster than other people. Now, something else that occurs to me as I'm looking at this is we've got this moon in opposition to the sun. So what that means is it's happening at the time of the full moon. The full moon has just happened, like not very long ago, a couple of hours before, but it's the full moon in the sign of Virgo. Now, the moon in Virgo, I don't think is very comfortable. You know, the moon is about our instincts, and it is about how organized and how clean and kind of natural we are, actually. It does help us have the instinct to go to ground. It helps us have the instinct to maybe be in the gentle cycles of life. And then on the other, so that's where our emotions are. And then we've got the sun in the sign of Pisces, which is our identity just being like, wow, we're kind of all connected. So this full moon, I think, is going to blow up a lot of things for people. You know, that idea that we want to be part of nature, that we want to manage cycles naturally and efficiently. And then there's this knowing, this inside knowing that we are spiritual beings in a flesh suit. So that is the polarity, really. Are we spirit? Are we flesh? And like, not everyone's going to get that. I mean, I guess it's the polarity between spirituality and rationality. So as Saturn's going into the sign of Pisces, which is our opportunity to go into great levels of healing, we're being divided at the same time. And maybe it's from that division that we get more confusion, that we're able to solve it for ourselves. Because I sometimes think that it has to get really bad for us to wake up and see what's really going on for us. You know, if we just always just manage to manage our emotions and just kind of scrape by, we never really have those life-changing events that, they change us and they move us and they put us onto a different timeline. They put us onto a different understanding. So yeah, this is pretty big. Saturn and Pluto are pretty much exactly 30 degrees away from each other. They have been for quite some time. But if anything, that's, I think, an indication that Saturn is wanting to control himself rather than being under the influence of Pluto. It's kind of working together. At the start of the pandemic phenomenon, I'm going to call it, Saturn and Pluto and Jupiter were all connected together. You know, so Jupiter and Saturn were really under the control of Pluto. And, you know, Jupiter moves faster and is now over here 3.5 years later, and Saturn, or 3 years later, and Saturn has managed to get further away, you know, just like 30 degrees away from Pluto. To me, it's an indication that maybe the middle managers that may have enacted some of these controls, that may have been some of the people trying to suppress the free expression of people, you know, some of them, as they're moving further away from the control of Pluto or Hades or the big controllers holding all the strings and everything, they're starting to maybe wake up and realize that they're more human than they realized, you know, that they are connected to people, they are connected to everyone. And, you know, how can you not want to be controlled yourself and yet control other people? If you want your own freedom, you have to let other people have their freedom too. It just doesn't work any other way. So interesting times. But I see that there's a respectful kind of nod in the direction of those people that might have all the money and all the power at the top, whilst also recognizing that maybe we become responsible for ourselves. I mean, let's also look at it from another perspective. You know, I've given, and it's you know, I take responsibility for the fact that I might sound less conforming and more escaping, more free flowing. You know, that I think is probably how I am, but it's not to cause anyone else any harm. Absolutely not. But let's look at it from the perspective of being a parent or being in charge of things. If you do think you are in charge of things and that you have the capacity to look after people that maybe aren't in their right minds to look after themselves, like I'm a mum, I've got 3 kids that are 4, 7 and 11. And obviously they need differing levels of care. My 11-year-old doesn't need as much as my 4-year-old. And my 7-year-old is somewhere in between. And I work with them in slightly different ways. So my 4-year-old gets slightly more stronger guidelines, but kind, because he can't understand where a lot of the strong stuff comes from. You know, so I'm really trying to look after him and keep him wrapped up a bit. My 11-year-old doesn't need as much wrapping, and that's a little bit like Saturn moving away from Pluto. So, you know, I think life abhors a vacuum. And so if there isn't anyone stepping up to manage everything, then people will appoint themselves. And, you know, people that appoint themselves as the God and King of everything, you know, they might not be the best people to self-appoint. However, as humanity starts to stand up and say, you know, I don't want you to control this, and actually, here are my thoughts. And as people start to work together, maybe under a more Jupiter or Uranian idea of, that there's a lovely vision that's being set forward and humanity can all join it together, and it's not forced. And, that might mean that some countries are a little bit more like this and other countries are a little bit more like that. And that let's make it work. People might start to step into responsibility. They might be stepping into adulthood. I do really think these times are about humanity growing up and growing into a new stage. So, not all authority is bad necessarily, The last thing that I really notice about this time, and that is that Ceres and Pluto are nicely in a balance. That's good because, that's more of a balance between hell and earth, like Pluto in mythology is known as having kidnapped Ceres's daughter and stolen her. And the idea that there's somebody living underground being tortured or sexualized or stolen from the earth, the goodness of the earth. And so what we're seeing here is energies working together so that nothing is hidden and nothing is so exposed that it becomes a target. It feels to me like there's more of a balance as Saturn is coming in. And again, with that balance comes the chance for us to heal. Okay. So that really brings me back to the end of my massive Saturn expose there. I hope it's been useful. I will totally chapterize it. It's going to have loads of little chapters. So you can go to the bits you need and not to the other bits. And I will be speaking more about it, but I hope it's been useful. If you think that you would love to explore this up close and personal when you're in chart, then please do just give me a shout. It's louisatannermunson@gmail.com, or just go to my website, which is feelgoodastrology.com. But anyway, however you are in the world right now, my biggest hope for you is the feeling of peace that comes from the final balancing of this whole Saturn period. We are coming to the end of a massive learning cycle, and I think humanity has really been through the ringer, more so than it has at any time. A lot of this has taken place unconsciously, and I think media and the way we live has really allowed it to kind of sneak up on us. We haven't been so actively responsible about what goes on in our lives. And so this is a particularly bitter pill to take right now. But I really do think we're going to be in a better place for it. And I'm really quite hopeful that we can all connect into this feeling of joy and this feeling of mutuality that doesn't exclude or make people wrong. That's my absolute hope. So anyway, lots and lots of love to you wherever you are in the world. And I hope to connect again with you real soon. Bye for now.
You've been listening to the Feel Good Astrology podcast with Louisa Tanner Munson. To request your personal reading, go to feelgoodastrology.com.